Bruno Valenti didn't beg. That was the thing Serena would never forgive herself for missing. The fact that her father, a man who had wept openly at her mother's funeral, who cried at old soccer matches on television, did not make a single sound when the men with guns walked through his front door. He just looked at the floor, like he'd been expecting them, like he'd already made the decision before they arrived. That silence told her everything she hadn't been allowed to know. If you've ever had someone you loved sell your life to settle their own debt, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Every city, every country. I want to know how far this story has traveled, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what happens next is the kind of story you don't want to walk into halfway through. So, the call came at 11:40 on a Wednesday night. Serena was still at her drafting table when her phone buzzed, her father's number, which was unusual because Bruno rarely called after 9. He'd developed that habit years ago, some rule he made for himself that he never fully explained. She answered without looking up from the blueprint she was correcting, a pencil still behind her ear. "Papa?" There was breathing on the other end. Not words, just breathing, and a sound underneath it that she couldn't immediately identify. Something low and persistent, like a motor running in a closed room. "Papa, I can hear you." "Serena." His voice came out wrong, flattened, like someone had pressed a hand over the normal shape of it. "Don't come over tonight." She set the pencil down. "What's happened?" "Nothing's happened. I'm tired. Go to sleep." "You called me to tell me to go to sleep?" Silence. "Papa?" The line went dead. She stared at her phone for 4 seconds. Then she grabbed her coat. The drive to her father's apartment in the Old Toronto district took 11 minutes at that hour. The streets emptied of tourists and the city quiet in a way that Florence only got late at night, when the stones stopped absorbing footsteps and started giving them back as echoes. Serena had made this drive 100 times. She knew every turn, every light, the specific way the Arno looked from the bridge at night, with the lamp reflections pulling long and gold across the black water. She almost didn't notice the black car parked across the street from his building. Almost. It was the engine that registered first, still running, exhaust rising faint in the cold, someone waiting. She drove past it without slowing and parked around the corner, and then she sat there with her hands on the wheel and talked herself out of leaving twice before she got out. The building door was unlocked. That was wrong. Bruno was meticulous about the door. The elevator was slow. She took the stairs. His apartment was on the 3rd floor, and she could hear voices before she reached the landing. Not loud, not aggressive, just the low, deliberate register of men who don't need to raise their voices to communicate that they're serious. She stopped with her hand on the stairwell door and listened through the metal. She caught fragments, a number she didn't understand, something in the millions. Her father's voice underneath, agreeing to something, one-word answers. "Yes, yes, I understand." And then a voice she didn't recognize, smooth and unhurried. "There's another option, Bruno. Let's talk about your daughter." Serena pushed through the door. There were 3 of them in the apartment. 2 she clocked immediately. Big men in dark clothing positioned near the windows. The kind of stillness to them that wasn't natural stillness, but trained stillness. The kind that means they've been taught where to stand so exits are covered. The 3rd was sitting across from her father at the kitchen table like they were old acquaintances sharing a late meal, except her father was gray-faced and there was a glass of water in front of him that he clearly hadn't touched. The man at the table looked up when she entered. He was somewhere in his 50s, fine-featured, with silver at his temples, and a suit that cost more than Serena's monthly rent. He didn't react to her arrival the way people react to surprises. There was no adjustment, no shift. He looked at her the same way she imagined he looked at everything, as a variable he'd already accounted for. "Serena," her father said, and the word came out like something breaking. "I told you not to come." "I know you did." She didn't look away from the man at the table. "Who are you?" "My name isn't important." He had the accent of someone educated across multiple countries, Italian underneath, other things layered on top. "What's important is that your father owes a significant debt to people who are not accustomed to patience, and that he's recently proposed a solution that concerns you directly." Her father made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. What kind of solution? Serena said. Bruno. The man at the table said her father's name with a very specific flatness, like a teacher calling on a student who'd already failed the test. Bruno Valenti looked at his daughter for the first time since she'd entered the room. His eyes were red-rimmed and his hands on the table were shaking, and he looked, she thought, like a man who'd been drowning for a long time in private and had only just run out of water to stay under. I owe them 4.3 million euros, he said. I don't have it. I don't have a tenth of it. He paused. I told them they could have you. The kitchen was very quiet. Serena heard the refrigerator humming. She heard her own pulse. You told them, she said slowly, they could have me. As collateral. As they said they'd cancel the debt. I thought, you thought. Serena, don't. She said it once, clearly, and Bruno stopped talking. The man at the table watched this exchange the way a surgeon watches a procedure he isn't performing, interested, clinical, unmoved. I want to know whose money this is, Serena said, turning back to him. I want to know who sent you. The money belongs to Luca DeSantis, the man said. You've heard the name. She had. Everyone in Italy who paid attention had. Luca DeSantis was a name that lived in rumors and court documents that never quite resulted in convictions, in newspaper investigations that occasionally got their authors reassigned to provincial beats, in the particular silence that fell over certain conversations at certain dinner tables when someone brought him up. He was 41 or 44, depending on which source you trusted. He'd inherited a financial empire from a father who'd built it from something older and less clean. He had legitimate businesses across 3 continents and a face that appeared occasionally in the society pages at charity events, handsome and serious and standing slightly apart from other people as though proximity itself was a kind of exposure he'd learned to minimize. He's in Florence? She asked. He's wherever he needs to be. And he sanctioned this? Using a person as collateral for a gambling debt? Something shifted in the man's expression. Not much. That remains to be determined. Our employer hasn't been informed of Bruno's specific proposal. We were sent to collect the debt or discuss alternatives. Bruno improvised. Serena looked at her father. Bruno had his face in his hands. Get out, she said to the man at the table. Leave your number. I want 24 hours. The man stood slowly. He buttoned his jacket with the precise movements of someone who'd never been rushed by anything in his life. You have until Friday morning, he said. That's 36 hours. I'd suggest using them. He nodded once, something between a greeting and a dismissal, and then he walked out. The 2 men at the windows followed without a word. The apartment door closed. Serena stood in the silence for a long moment. Then she said, How long? Bruno didn't look up. Papa, how long have you been gambling with mafia money? It wasn't like that at the beginning. It started smaller, a game here, a private table. I won, actually, for a while. I thought, you keep saying you thought. I know. His voice cracked on the word. I know, Serena. I know what I've done. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in months, maybe years. He'd aged badly and fast since her mother died. The structure of him had changed. He was 61 years old, and he looked 80, and sitting across from his daughter in this kitchen with the water glass still untouched between them, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who had made catastrophic choices and understood them completely only now, when the bill had arrived in human form. Tell me everything, she said. Not the version that makes you look better. Everything. He talked for 2 hours. The debt had started 4 years ago, shortly after her mother's death. Bruno had always had a weakness for cards. Serena had known this in the background way that children know things about their parents that the parents haven't articulated, the way she'd always noticed how he came home lighter or heavier from certain evenings with certain friends without being told what had happened. But the drinking that followed the funeral had lowered some last internal barrier, and he'd found his way to private games in the back of a restaurant near the Piazza della Repubblica, and then to larger games in rented rooms she didn't know existed, and then into debt that he'd managed to service and then couldn't, and finally into borrowing against the debt itself, which was how the money had turned from someone's money into mafia money without him, he claimed, fully understanding when the line had been crossed. She believed parts of this. She wasn't sure which parts. 4.3 million, she said again when he finished, and some interest. Papa, I know. I don't have that money. You know I don't have it. I know. And what you proposed, what you actually said to that man, was that they could take me instead. Bruno Valenti looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, and he did not look away. Whatever else he was, whatever failures had accumulated into this night, he owed her this much. Yes, he said. As what? As what exactly? He said DeSantis sometimes takes people, talented people, puts them to work until the debt is paid. I thought, you're an architect, you're intelligent. I thought it was better than... He stopped. Better than what? He didn't answer. She understood that what he meant was better than what they do to the people who can't pay and don't have anything to offer. Better than the things that happened at the end of stories like this one. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the street. The black car was gone. I need to think, she said. Serena, don't apologize right now. I can't hear it right now. She heard him exhale. She stood at the window and looked at the street where the car had been and thought about her life, which, until approximately 2 hours ago, had consisted of a small but promising design firm she'd built herself over 5 years, an apartment she liked, a cat named after a Renaissance painter who ignored her reliably, and the specific satisfaction of watching something she'd drawn on paper become a structure that people walked through. She had worked hard for this life. She had built it in the particular way you build something after grief, carefully, deliberately, one piece at a time, like you're proving to yourself that things can be constructed after they've been destroyed. And now her father had proposed trading it for a gambling debt. She turned from the window. I'll meet with him, she said. Bruno looked up. What? DeSantis. I want to meet with him directly, not his men. Him. Serena, you don't understand who he... I understand exactly who he is. I'm asking you to make it happen. You owe me that. You owe me significantly more than that, but start there. Bruno opened his mouth, closed it. He looked like he wanted to argue and understood he had no standing to. Call the man who was here tonight, she said. Tell him his employer has 36 hours to agree to a meeting. Or I go to the Financial Crimes Bureau in the morning with everything you've just told me, and they can sort it out from there. That would destroy me. Yes, it would. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd dropped it. Make the call, Papa. She left him sitting in his kitchen with the untouched water glass between his hands. The meeting was arranged by 9 the following morning. No address was given. A car arrived at the hotel where Serena had spent the night. She hadn't gone home, hadn't trusted herself to sleep, had spent the dark hours reworking the situation from every angle she could locate and arriving at the same place each time. She had no leverage except the willingness to be a problem for everyone, herself included. She'd made herself coffee from the inadequate hotel machine at 4 in the morning and sat on the edge of the bed and said to the empty room, "You've survived worse." She wasn't sure that was true, but she said it anyway. The car was black and the windows were tinted, and the driver said nothing beyond confirming her name. They drove for nearly 2 hours, north out of Florence, up into the lake country, the landscape changing from the flat river valley into hills, and then into something older and steeper and greener, the road narrowing between stone walls. She watched it go and kept her breathing even, and did not look at her phone. The property emerged from a bend in the road like it had grown there. A stone fortress set against a hillside above Lake Como, centuries old at its foundations, and expanded by each subsequent owner into something that read more as compound than home, long walls and multiple structures and grounds that she could see even from the car were maintained with obsessive precision. Iron gates opened as they approached. She didn't ask how they knew they were coming. They took her through a side entrance, not the front, a detail she noted, a staff entrance or something that functioned like one. A long corridor, stone floors, inadequate lighting in the way of old buildings that had been electrified as an afterthought. A woman in dark clothing appeared briefly to take her coat and then disappeared. She was shown into a room that might have been a study or a library or both, lined with books she didn't have time to read the spines of, two windows overlooking the water, and a fireplace that was burning despite the fact that it was late morning and not particularly cold. She stood in the center of the room and waited. She didn't sit. She'd made that decision in the car. She would arrive standing and stay that way. She would not arrange herself in a chair like something placed there for his review. Luca DeSantis entered from a door she hadn't noticed on the far wall. She'd expected something. Power, she supposed, tends to curate its own appearance. The right suit, the right posture, the particular way of entering a room that announces itself. And those things were present. But what she hadn't expected was the quality of his attention. He looked at her the way she looked at buildings, not evaluating exactly, but reading, looking for where the structure was and whether it held. He was taller than the photograph suggested. The silver at his temples was more pronounced. There was a scar on his jaw that the society page images had always managed to avoid, and she registered it now because it was the most honest thing about his face. "Ms. Valenti," he said, "Mr. DeSantis." He gestured toward a chair. She stayed where she was. Something moved through his expression, not offense, more like the registration of a data point. "You wanted to see me," he said. "My father proposed using me as settlement for a debt he created. I wanted to hear from you whether that's the kind of arrangement you consider acceptable." "No," he said. She hadn't expected that either. "No?" she said. "No, it's not." He moved to the far window, stood with his back partially to her. Below them, the lake was very still, silver and green in the late morning light. Bruno Valenti owes 4.3 million euros to a financial instrument connected to my operations. His debt is real and his inability to pay is real. His proposal regarding you was not authorized and would not have been accepted. Then what does happen to him? That depends on Bruno. I'd like it to depend on me. He turned then, looked at her directly. Why? Because I'm here and he isn't, and because I have something he doesn't have. Which is, "I'm not afraid of you," she said. Which wasn't entirely true, but true enough. The fear was there. She could feel it in her chest, a tightness that wasn't going away, but it wasn't in her voice, and right now her voice was what mattered. He studied her for a long moment. "Sit down, Ms. Valenti," he said. Not an order. Something that had once been an order and had been softened at the last moment into something approaching a request. This time she sat. He sat across from her. Between them on the table was nothing. No papers, no contract, no glass of water, just the space of a negotiation that hadn't yet found its shape. "Here is what I'm willing to offer," he said. 1 year. You remain under my protection for 1 year while the question of your father's debt is resolved. You'll have work, real work, work consistent with your profession. You'll have freedom within reasonable limits. At the end of the year, the debt is cleared and you leave. And if I say no, then Bruno faces what Bruno's choices have built. And the men who came to his apartment, the suggestion about me, those men will answer for exceeding their instructions. She looked at him. She was trying to read the room the way she read buildings, find where the structure was, whether the load-bearing walls were where they appeared to be. He returned her look without blinking, without the slight adjustments most people made under scrutiny, the small self-consciousness that showed up in the eyes. "What are the reasonable limits?" she said. "No contact with rivals, no disclosure of what you see here, no attempt to leverage what you learn against my interests. And if I feel unsafe, you come to me directly. And you'll do what?" "Whatever is necessary," he said. "That's not a threat directed at you. It's the only honest answer I can give." She sat with this. Outside, a bird moved across the window and disappeared. "I want it in writing," she said. "Obviously. I want my father's debt canceled in writing as well. Full cancellation, not suspended. Canceled." A pause. "Upon completion of the year?" "Yes." He nodded once. "Then we have an agreement," he said. Serena Valenti looked at Luca DeSantis across the empty table in the room above the lake, and understood that she had just signed the next year of her life to the most dangerous man in Italy on behalf of a father who had offered her up like a debt payment, and that this was somehow the better of the available options, and that she was going to have to live with what that said about the situation she was in. "We have an agreement," she said. The fire crackled in the grate. Neither of them moved to shake hands. The contract arrived that evening, drawn up in formal Italian with an English translation attached. Serena read both versions twice. She found no trap she could identify, which, she reminded herself, was not the same as there being no trap. She signed it at the desk in the room she'd been given, which overlooked the eastern face of the property, the stone wall and the hillside, and beyond it the water going dark now with the last of the light. The pen felt very heavy in her hand. She signed and capped the pen and set it down and looked at what she'd done for exactly 10 seconds. Then she went to the window and stood there and watched the lake go black in the dusk. Somewhere in this building, a man controlled everything and owed explanations to no one. And somewhere in Florence, her father was sitting in his kitchen with his hands shaking around a glass of water he was too ashamed to drink. She had 36 hours ago been a woman with a small firm and a cat and a life she was proud of. She was still standing in her own shoes. That would have to be enough for now. 2 floors below, she could hear the house settling. The deep particular sounds of old stone recalibrating itself in the cooling night. She listened to it for a long time before she finally moved away from the window. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. The first night inside the fortress above Lake Como, and already something had shifted in the air. Something she couldn't name yet. Something that felt less like captivity and more like the moment before a storm, when the pressure changes and the world holds its breath and waits to see what it's about to become. She was given a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced east, and at 6 in the morning the light came through it flat and cold and indifferent, the way light does when it has no interest in how you're feeling. Serena had been awake for most of the night, not from fear exactly. The fear had settled into something lower and steadier, like a frequency she'd stopped hearing consciously, but from the particular alertness of a person in an unfamiliar structure, listening to its sounds and cataloging them. Old stone. Central heating that ran through pipes too narrow for the volume of water pushed through them. Footsteps, twice, in the corridor outside her door. Not furtive, just the footsteps of a house that never fully slept. At some point past 3, she'd gotten up and stood at the window and looked at the grounds below, lit by low security lights, and counted what she could identify. 2 men on rotation. A dog, large, dark, moving with the leash-free confidence of an animal that had been trained past the need for one. The lake beyond the wall, invisible but present in the particular darkness beyond the stone. She'd gone back to bed and lain there with her hands folded on her stomach like someone in a coffin, and thought, "You signed a contract. That's what you did. You exchanged 1 year of your life for your father's debt, and now you're lying in a Mafia Billionaire's fortress above Lake Como, and you need to decide how to function in the morning." By 5:30, she'd decided. She would work. She would observe. She would not make the mistake of thinking that any kindness she was shown here was anything other than strategy, and she would find a way home. Breakfast was served in a long room on the ground floor that was clearly not a dining room for guests. It was a working room, a table that had been used for meetings before it was used for meals, marked with the faint ghosts of coffee rings and the indentations of pens pressed too hard on documents. A woman named Julia brought food without being asked and left without speaking. The food was simple: bread, good olive oil, sliced fruit, coffee that was genuinely excellent, and Serena ate it alone at one end of the long table and watched the room. 2 men came through at different points. Neither acknowledged her. One of them was young, maybe 25, with the careful blankness of someone who'd been told to behave a certain way around her and was working at it. The other was older, heavy-set, and he glanced at her once with an expression she couldn't read before continuing through to the adjacent room. Luca DeSantis did not appear for breakfast. She'd expected that, or something like it. The establishment of rhythm and distance, the structure of a household showing her where she fit. She was not a guest. She was not staff. She was something for which this house apparently had no existing category, and so it was treating her as a temporary anomaly and waiting to see where she settled. At 7:45, Julia returned and said simply, "He'll see you now." Done. He was in a room she hadn't been to. An office, though that word didn't quite cover it. It was large and severe, with the kind of organized density that suggested a mind that worked across many fronts simultaneously. 3 screens on a standing desk. Files, physical files, which surprised her. Maps pinned to a board she couldn't see clearly from where she stood. And Luca, not at the desk, but at the window, a coffee cup in his hand, looking out at the lake with the look of a man completing a thought. He turned when she entered. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some." "Julia can get you anything you need for the room. If the bed is fine." She didn't want to talk about the room. "You said there would be work, consistent with my profession. I'd like to know what that means." He set the coffee down, moved to the desk and picked up a folder, brought it to the side table and opened it without ceremony. The estate has 3 structures in various states of renovation. 2 of them have stalled because the previous architect resigned under circumstances I won't detail. The 3rd hasn't been started. I need someone who can assess what's been done, identify what's been done wrong, and draw up a plan to finish. She crossed to the table and looked at the folder. Photographs. Partial floor plans. A construction timeline that had clearly been abandoned mid-column. "This is legitimate work," she said. "Yes. You're not asking me to design anything connected to your—" She gestured vaguely. "No. The estate is separate from my operations. What happens in these walls is residential. I want the buildings finished." She looked at the photographs. The main structure was a renovated outbuilding, 18th century, she guessed, with additions from at least 3 different periods that had never been made to agree with each other. It was the kind of building that had opinions about itself. Stubborn, layered, resistant to the kind of modernization that would erase what it had been. She felt, against her best intentions, a small pull of genuine interest. "I'll need to walk the sites," she said. "Of course." "Alone, without someone following me." A pause. "Within the walls of the property. Beyond the walls, someone goes with you." "Fine." She closed the folder and picked it up. "Is there anything else?" "Yes." He said it without shifting his tone, which meant she'd been about to leave at the exact moment he'd intended her to stop. She understood it was deliberate and stayed. "There are people in this house who don't know what to make of you. Some of them will test that. I want you to tell me directly if anyone causes you a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Any kind." She looked at him. "And you'll handle it?" "Yes." "Why should I believe that?" He didn't flinch from the question. "Because handling it serves my interests. I signed a contract too, Ms. Valenti." It was, she thought, the most honest thing he could have said. Not reassurance, not warmth, just the cold architecture of mutual interest, which was at least something she could build on. "Serena," she said. He looked at her. "If I'm going to be here for a year, Miss Valenti is going to get exhausting. Serena is fine." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, something that had been a smile once and retained the structure. "Luca," he said. She nodded and left with the folder. The first test came that afternoon. His name was Marco Riva, and she learned this later. At the time, he was simply a broad-shouldered man in his 30s who appeared beside her at the outbuilding site while she was measuring the eastern wall and said, without introduction, "You shouldn't be here." Serena didn't stop measuring. "I have permission to be here." His permission. The word came loaded in a specific way. "Yes." "And you think that means something? That his permission means you're safe here?" She lowered the measuring tape and turned to look at him fully. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once and had been lived in too hard, jaw too tight, eyes with that particular flat quality that came from spending years reading situations for threat. He was looking at her the way men sometimes looked at things they'd decided were problems before the problems had done anything to confirm it. "I think it means I'm measuring this wall," she said, "which is what I was doing before you arrived. You're a stranger in this house. I'm aware. Strangers ask questions. They move around. They notice things. I'm an architect. I notice load-bearing walls and drainage problems. Is there something specific you want to say to me, or are you planning to keep being threatening in a general direction?" His jaw tightened. She'd surprised him. She could see it, the small recalibration. He'd expected fear or submission and gotten neither, and now he was reassessing. "Watch yourself," he said finally. "I'll add it to the list," she said, and turned back to the wall. She heard him leave. She waited until the sound of his footsteps had fully gone before she let out a slow breath and put her hand against the cold stone to steady herself. Her fingers were shaking slightly. She gave them 30 seconds, and then they stopped, and she went back to work. Deaths. She told Luca that evening. He was in the same office, still working. She had the impression he worked continuously, that the hours he wasn't visible were spent on something rather than nothing. He listened to her account of Marco Riva with his elbows on the desk and his hands folded and his eyes very still. When she finished, he said, "You weren't frightened. I was frightened. I didn't show it. That's better than not being frightened." He stood, moved to the window in what she was beginning to recognize as his habitual motion when processing something. "Marco will be spoken to. I don't want to cause problems." "You didn't cause a problem. Marco caused a problem. There's a difference, and it matters." He said it without looking at her. In this house, the difference between those two things determines outcomes. She stayed in the doorway. He said, "Strangers notice things." "They do. What am I supposed to not notice?" He turned then, looked at her across the room. "Nothing specific. Marco has his own anxieties and he displaces them. Don't take his concern as policy." She nodded, turned to leave. "Serena." She stopped. "You did well," he said. Not warm, just accurate. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the way he'd said that, the precision of it, the complete absence of the patronizing note that compliments usually carried, like it was simply a fact he was reporting. "You did well," statement of record. She didn't know what to do with that, so she opened the folder and went back to work. The poisoned wine happened on the 9th day. She'd been at a dinner, the first she'd been included in, a meal with Luca and 4 men whose names she'd been given, but whose roles she was still mapping. Business dinner, she understood, though nothing explicitly about business was said in front of her. She was there as something between presents and furniture, she suspected, and she was fine with that. She watched. She ate. She kept her expression neutral and her observations internal. The wine was poured by someone she hadn't seen before. A young man, new staff, moving efficiently through the room. Her glass was filled. She lifted it. Luca, from the other end of the table, said her name. Not loudly, just her name. She looked at him. He was watching the young man who'd poured the wine. Something in his posture had changed. The specific stillness of a man who'd seen something and was calculating the cost of acting on it. He said something in Italian, rapid and low, to the man beside him. The man beside him stood and crossed to where the young server had retreated. An exchange she couldn't hear. The server's face changed. Luca looked at Serena. "Don't drink that," he said. She set the glass down. The room had gone very quiet. 30 seconds later, 2 of Luca's men had the server against the wall in the corridor outside, and the glass had been taken away. And the dinner was over in the specific way that events ended in this house. Not with explanation, but with swift rearrangement. Everything cleared away and the surface restored, while the thing that had happened continued happening somewhere out of sight. Luca found her in the corridor near her room an hour later. "Someone paid him," he said. "Young, needed money. They told him it was a sedatives, that you'd be removed from the property while you slept." "Removed to where?" "We don't know yet." She leaned against the wall. The corridor was cold and the stone was rough through the fabric of her jacket, and she focused on that, the physical, specific texture of it, the realness of it. "Someone inside," she said. "Yes." "Someone who knows I'm here, knows my routine, knew which event to use." "Yes." She looked at him. He was close, closer than he usually stood, and she understood that the proximity was intentional, that he was reading her for the particular kind of fracture that came after a near miss, the delayed reaction that hit people when the danger had passed, and the body finally received the invoice. "I'm not going to fall apart," she said. "I know." "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I'm watching to find out." She almost laughed. "Didn't." Who would want me gone? I've been here 9 days. I haven't done anything. You don't have to do anything, he said. Someone wants leverage over me. Your leverage. The word landed exactly as heavy as it deserved to. She felt it. What are you going to do? Find them. He said it the way other people said they were going to make coffee. Certain and mundane and completely without question. Stay inside the building until I do. For how long? As long as it takes. She wanted to argue. She looked at his face and understood the argument wouldn't move anything. Fine, she said. He held her gaze for one extra second. She had the strange sensation of being read very accurately by something very precise, and then he moved away down the corridor and was gone. She stayed against the wall until the cold of the stone had finished working through her jacket and started working on her skin. And then she went into her room and locked the door and sat in the chair by the window and allowed herself, finally and in private, to be frightened. She stayed inside for 4 days. She worked from the photographs and the partial plans, building her assessment of the outbuildings on paper while the actual building sat outside in autumn rain she could see from the window. She asked Julia for books, and Julia brought them without comment. History of the lake region, structural engineering references, and one novel in English that Julia had perhaps chosen at random, or perhaps not. She didn't ask. Marco Riva had not appeared again. She didn't know what Luca had said to him, or where he was. The men she passed in the corridors had shifted in their behavior. Not warmer, but more careful. Like a calibration had occurred. On the 5th day, Luca came to her room with 2 files. He didn't sit. He set the files on the desk and stood with his hands in his pockets and the specific controlled stillness she now associated with him delivering information he'd already processed but was presenting carefully. The server gave us a name, he said. The contact who paid him is connected to a family in the South. Historically, they've had no argument with me. Historically? Yes. So, something changed. Or someone pointed them at me. He paused. Or pointed them at you. She turned in her chair to face him. Me specifically. The instruction was to take you somewhere, not to harm you, not to remove you from my protection permanently, just to temporarily displace you, create uncertainty. He looked at her with that reading the structure quality. Someone wanted me to doubt you. The implication settled over the room. You thought I was involved, she said. He didn't deny it immediately, which she respected even as it put a cold edge on the morning. I considered it. And now? Now I don't. Why not? Because the attack was designed to make me suspect you, which means the person who designed it is not you. It's someone who knew you'd be the most effective target to use against me. He said this with a kind of dispassion that was its own form of honesty. You're useful to someone as a problem I'll doubt myself about. Serena turned this over in her head. She was an architect. She thought in structures, in the relationships between things, the way weight transferred and distributed. The structure of what he was describing had a specific shape. Someone inside, she said again. Yes. Someone close enough to know the dinner was happening and who would be there. Yes. And you don't know who. He looked at her steadily. Not yet. She looked back at him. You're telling me all of this, she said. Why? Because you're going to be here for a year and you need to know the actual situation you're in. And because, he paused, and she had the sense of words being measured before use. Because you think clearly. I watched you manage Marco Riva. I watched you at dinner before the wine. You observe and you don't react too quickly. That's worth something in my current situation. You're not going to tell me I'm useful again. I already told you your leverage, he said. Useful is an upgrade. This time she did almost smile. What do you want from me? Nothing except to be honest about what's happening, so you're not navigating blind. She looked at the files on the desk. Can I read those? A pause. Not those, but I'll have others brought that you can. She nodded. He moved toward the door. Luca. He stopped. Whoever's inside, she said. They know you well enough to know how to use me against you. That's not someone new. He stood very still for a moment. His back was to her, and she could see the slight change in the set of his shoulders. Not much, barely anything. But it was there. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." He left. Serena sat for a long time looking at the files he'd placed on the desk and not touched again. Then she opened her own notes and wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. "The enemy is already in the room." The sabotaged elevator happened 2 weeks later. She should have taken the stairs. She usually took the stairs, old habit, preference for movement over waiting. But she was carrying a large roll of architectural drawings, and the stairs meant maneuvering, and the elevator was right there. She stepped in, pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator moved 6 inches and stopped. Then it dropped. Not the full drop of catastrophic failure, 3 feet, maybe less, with a sickening jolt that sent the drawing roll into the wall and Serena into the corner, her knee connecting with the metal panel and her shoulder hitting the handrail hard enough to leave bruises she'd find in the mirror 3 hours later. The emergency brake caught. The box swayed once and held. She was suspended between floors in a metal box that smelled of old machinery and something burnt. She was very calm for approximately 10 seconds. Then she said several things in Italian that she hadn't known she knew. The door was forced open 20 minutes later by 2 of Luca's men, and the elevator mechanic, who arrived 40 minutes after that, found the brake cable, not cut, too obvious, but scored. Scored in a way that would hold under normal load and fail under slightly elevated weight, the calculation of someone who knew how the mechanism worked and had enough access to reach it. Luca found her in the medical room where she was having her knee looked at by a calm man whose name she never got. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and something in his face was different. Not the controlled processing she'd learned to read, but something underneath it, something tighter. "The drawings," she said immediately. "Recovered, undamaged." "Good," she hissed as the man pressed on her knee. "Not broken, just—" "I know," Luca said. 2 in 3 weeks, she said. "Whoever this is, they're not patient." "No." "They're also not random. The wine was about making you doubt me. The elevator is—" She stopped, thought about it. "The elevator is a message." "What kind of message?" "That they can reach me any time. That your protection has a ceiling." She looked at him. "They're not trying to kill me. They're demonstrating access." He crossed his arms. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the map on his office wall, locating something in relation to something else. "Vittorio has been with me for 11 years, he said. Not to her. More like a statement delivered to the room, to the air, to the structure of a trust he was in the process of dismantling. Serena went very still. "Who is Vittorio?" He seemed to come back from wherever he'd been, his eyes focused on her. "My financial advisor." "Why are you thinking about him right now?" "Because he's the only person in this house who knew the elevator inspection schedule. Because he suggested you be given the second-floor room. Because he's been asking questions about you that aren't consistent with his role." He said each of these things with the flat precision of a man reading an inventory. "I've been resistant to the conclusion." 11 years is a long time to resist." "Yes." She looked at him. "Don't confront him yet." He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because if he's doing this for someone else, confronting him collapses whatever network he's part of before you understand the shape of it. You'll get him, but you won't get the rest." She shifted on the examination table, winced. "Let him think he's still invisible. Give him room to move and see where he goes." Luca studied her for a long moment. "You understand this work," he said. "I understand structures," she said. "People are just a different kind." He looked at her, the long, reading look, and she held it this time without the effort it had cost her the first few times. She was learning the territory of his attention, the specific quality of being seen by something that missed very little. "Rest," he said. "I have drawings to—" "Rest," he said again, and left. She sat on the edge of the examination table and looked at the bruise forming on her knee and thought about a man named Vittorio who had been inside Luca de Santis's empire for 11 years and was now using her as a demonstration of access. and she thought about what that meant, and what was driving it, and why, in the specific forensic way she thought about buildings. The structure of it didn't quite make sense yet. There was a load-bearing element she hadn't located, something the whole conspiracy was resting on that she couldn't see. She thought about her mother. She didn't know why. Just an image, sudden and unwelcome. Her mother at a drafting table not unlike Serena's own, bent over something in the lamplight, her pen moving with the concentration of someone solving a problem that mattered. She pushed the image away, lay back on the examination table and stared at the ceiling. The cold of the room worked through her clothing. The bruise on her knee announced itself in pulses. Outside, somewhere above Lake Como, the autumn was becoming something harder and more permanent, the last of the warmth going out of the air the way certainty went out of situations that had seemed stable until they didn't. She was 24 days into a year she hadn't chosen, in a house where someone with 11 years of access and intimate knowledge of its master's operations was using her body as a chessboard. And the man she was supposed to fear had just stood in the doorway of a medical room and looked at her bruises with something in his face she didn't have a clean name for yet, something that sat adjacent to fury and slightly too close to something else for either of them to push the image away. Lay back on the examination table and stared at the ceiling. The cold of the room worked through her clothing. The bruise on her knee announced itself in pulses. Outside, somewhere above Lake Como, the autumn was becoming something harder and more permanent, the last of the warmth going out of the air, the way certainty went out of situations that had seemed stable until they didn't. She was 24 days into a year she hadn't chosen, in a house where someone with 11 years of access and intimate knowledge of its master's operations was using her body as a chessboard. And the man she was supposed to fear had just stood in the doorway of a medical room and looked at her bruises with something in his face she didn't have a clean name for yet. She sat up, reached for her jacket. Julia appeared in the doorway with a tray. Tea, something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be a warm compress. She set it down without comment, the way she did everything, and turned to leave. Julia, Serena said it before she'd decided to. How long have you worked here? Julia paused. 14 years. Do you know a man named Vittorio Moretti? The pause that followed was exactly 1 beat too long. Everyone here knows Vittorio, she said, and left. Serena sat with that beat of silence, turning it over. 14 years, and the name produced that specific hesitation. Not fear, not loyalty. Something more complicated. The expression of someone who had decided a long time ago that knowing certain things was more dangerous than not knowing them, and had organized their entire working life around that decision. She drank the tea. She thought. Her mother had been an architect too. That detail had lived in the background of Serena's life the way origin stories did. Present, formative, not interrogated. Her mother had worked on private commissions, wealthy clients, contracts that required discretion. She had died when Serena was 19, a cardiac event, fast. The doctor said she likely felt nothing, which was the thing people said when they wanted to give you something to hold on to. She had left Serena her drafting tools, her notebooks, and a set of blueprints Serena had never fully understood. Complex, layered, referencing structures she'd never been able to identify, annotated in a shorthand her mother had invented and never explained. She had kept them because they were her mother's. She had never thought of them as anything else. She thought of them now. The thought arrived without ceremony, without drama, just a cold and specific clarity, the kind that came when a structure finally revealed its load-bearing wall. Why her? Why Bruno had been maneuvered into this specific debt with these specific people? Why someone was so determined to displace her from this house before she could look too closely at anything? She set the tea down. Her hands were not shaking this time. She needed to get to Florence. She needed to get to those blueprints before whoever was moving against her understood that she'd finally started asking the right questions. The door to the corridor was 12 feet away. Luca's name was in her phone. And somewhere in this house, a man named Vittorio Moretti was still sitting comfortably inside 11 years of trust, watching her and waiting to see how much she actually knew. She didn't know enough yet, but she was going to. She went to Luca that night, not because she trusted him completely. She wasn't there yet, might never be there. Trust being the kind of structure that required time and load testing before you committed weight to it. She went because he was the only person in this house whose interests currently aligned with hers, and because what she was carrying was too heavy to hold alone in a room above a lake, while a man named Vittorio Moretti slept somewhere down the corridor. Luca's office was lit. She'd noticed that about him. He kept late hours the way some people kept a religion, with consistency and without explanation. She knocked once, and he said, "Come in," before the sound had finished. He was at the standing desk. He looked at her face and closed whatever was on the screen in front of him. "Sit down," he said. "I need to go to Florence." "No. I need to go to Florence because I think I know why I'm here." She stayed standing. "Not your contract, not my father's debt. The actual reason someone has been trying to move me since the second week." He was very still. "Tell me." So she told him about her mother. She told it the way she'd been turning it over for the past 3 hours. Not linear, not polished, but in the way understanding actually arrived, which was sideways and in pieces, and with the specific discomfort of realizing that something you'd held as one kind of object was actually another kind entirely. Her mother's work, the private commissions, the blueprints she'd left behind, complex and annotated in a shorthand that Serena had assumed was personal habit, an architect's private notation system. She stopped, made herself say the next part clearly. "I think the annotations are an encryption. I think my mother hid something inside those drawings, and I think Vittorio Moretti knows what it is." The silence in the office had a specific quality, not empty but dense, the way air got before weather. "What was your mother's name?" Luca said. "Anna. Anna Valenti. Before she married, Anna Ferraro." Something crossed his face. Not surprise. It was past surprise. Something on the other side of it. The expression of a man who had just watched two unconnected lines on a map converge at a point he should have found years ago. "Anna Ferraro," he said. "You knew her." "I knew of her. She worked for a development firm in Milan in the 90s, Rossetti Developments." He moved away from the desk. Rossetti Developments was a front. It laundered money for 6 different criminal organizations across northern Italy and Switzerland. It collapsed in 2003 when the lead accountant turned state's evidence. He paused. The accountant's name was Vittorio Moretti. The room went very quiet. Serena heard her own breathing. She heard the fire. She heard distantly the lake doing whatever lakes did at 11 at night. "He was the informant," she said. "He was the informant who gave just enough to satisfy the prosecutors and kept the rest. Kept names, kept account structures, kept enough to rebuild under different ownership." Luca's voice was flat and meticulous, like he was reading from a document she couldn't see. "He came to me 4 years later with impeccable references and a financial mind I'd seen nothing like. I brought him in. And my mother. Your mother was the architect on 3 of the Rossetti properties. She would have seen the structural documents, the real ones, the ones that showed where the money moved and how." He stopped at the window. His reflection was dark against the glass. If she encoded what she knew into the blueprints, it would expose everything, Serena said. Not just what Rossetti did, what Vittorio kept, what he's been running since. She pressed her hand against the desk. "That's why he let my father into those gambling games. That's why he let the debt grow. He needed a way to get me inside this house under circumstances that looked unrelated to him. So he could find the blueprints. So he could find out if I knew. And when he realized I didn't," she stopped. "The wine wasn't about making you doubt me. The elevator wasn't a demonstration of access. Those were searches. He was trying to get into my room." Luca turned from the window. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the controlled processing, not the reading the structure quality. Something stripped of its professional surface. Something that was just a man who had kept a viper in his house for 11 years and was only now feeling the specific cold of that knowledge settle into his bones. "I need to go to Florence," she said again. "I know," he said. "We go tomorrow, together." They left before dawn. 2 cars, 4 men, Luca in the back seat beside her with a phone against his ear for the first 40 minutes, and then silent for the rest of the drive. Watching the road the way he watched everything, as a series of variables to be monitored. Serena had slept for 2 hours and felt it. The specific, gritty quality of insufficient sleep layered over sustained stress. She drank coffee from a thermos Julia had pressed into her hands at the door and watched the highway unspool in the headlights. She hadn't told her father they were coming. The decision had been instinctive, and she'd examined it in the dark of the early morning and decided it was correct. Not because she didn't trust Bruno. Her feelings about her father were currently too complicated to be reduced to trust or its absence. But because Bruno talked when he was nervous, and he was always nervous, and if Vittorio had any line of communication to him, any at all, the element of surprise was worth more than the courtesy of a warning call. They reached the old Trarno district at 8:40, parked around the corner from the building, the same corner where she'd parked 6 weeks ago on the night that had ended her previous life. She noted this without sentiment. There was no version of this morning that had room for sentiment. Bruno answered the door in his bathrobe, unshaven, a coffee cup in one hand, and the look on his face when he saw her cycled through relief and guilt and fear in about 3 seconds before landing on something that was all three at once. He looked at Luca behind her, his mouth opened. "Inside," Serena said. Ian. The blueprints were in a flat storage box in the back of the hall closet where Serena had put them after her mother's death and where they had stayed, under winter coats and a broken umbrella stand, for 5 years. She pulled the box out herself. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that. She brought them to the kitchen table and unrolled the first one carefully, weighting the corners with her coffee cup and Bruno's and 2 salt shakers from the counter. Luca stood across from her. Bruno stood in the doorway of the kitchen looking at the blueprints with the expression of a man watching something he didn't understand but knew was important. The drawings were her mother's. Unmistakably, the drafting hand is recognizable to Serena as a voice. Clean primary lines, detailed annotations in the margin, the specific combination of technical precision and handwritten notes that had been Anna Valenti's working style. 3 sets of blueprints, each for a different building. Commercial properties, large floor plans, complex internal structures. Serena looked at the annotations. She'd looked at them before, years ago, and seen a notation system. She looked at them now, knowing what she was looking for, and what had seemed like architectural shorthand began to resolve into something else. Numbers embedded in measurement notations, letter sequences in what appeared to be material specifications, a layered language that used the grammar of architectural documentation to say something entirely different underneath. "She was meticulous," Serena said quietly. "Can you read it?" Luca asked. "I can read her. I grew up watching her work." She leaned closer. "Give me time." He gave her time. He was good at that, she'd noticed, at the particular discipline of not filling silence with noise. Bruno made coffee and set it near her elbow, and she drank it without looking up. 40 minutes in, she found the first account number. 43 minutes in, she found the name attached to it. She stood up straight. "Luca." He was beside her in 2 steps. She pointed at the notation, translated it for him in a low voice. The account, the name, the institution, not Italian, not Swiss, further, a structure designed to be invisible. He looked at it for a long time. "There are more," she said. "This is just the first layer." "How long to get the rest?" "Hours? Maybe the full day." He pulled out his phone, made a call she couldn't hear the other end of, moving to the far side of the kitchen. She watched his shoulders while she waited, that small vocabulary of posture she'd been learning, the way tension lived in him differently than it lived in other people. More compressed, less visible, but no less present. He came back. "We have the day. My men are outside. Nobody comes in or out without—" Bruno's phone rang. All 3 of them looked at it on the counter. Bruno moved toward it. Luca's hand came out, not grabbing, just intercepting the flat of his palm against Bruno's chest. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He nodded at Bruno. Bruno answered. Put it on speaker without being asked, because whatever else Bruno Valenti was, he understood in this moment with a clarity that fear sometimes produced exactly what was required of him. The voice on the other end was smooth, unhurried, cultured in the specific way of someone who'd spent decades constructing a version of themselves designed to inspire confidence. "Bruno," said Vittorio Moretti, "I understand you have visitors." Nobody breathed. I want to speak with your daughter, Vittorio said. Serena reached out and took the phone from her father's hand. I'm here, she said. Good morning, Serena. I've been hoping we'd have a chance to speak without intermediaries. A pause. I think you've recently discovered something about your mother's work. I'd like to discuss it with you, privately. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it is. Because I have your father's debt documentation in my possession. The real documentation. The version that shows Bruno didn't fall into gambling by accident. The version that shows he was recruited, coerced into accessing financial records from Luca's personal accounts. Another pause, longer, shaped carefully. The version that Luca hasn't seen yet. Would you like to discuss terms, or should I simply send it to him now? The kitchen was absolutely silent. Serena looked at Luca. His face had gone to stone. She looked at her father. Bruno Valenti was looking at the floor, the same way he'd been looking at the floor on the night the men with guns had come through his door. The same position shame, the same practice study of the tile pattern, the same body that had already made its decision before anyone else in the room knew there was a decision being made. Papa, she said. He didn't look up. Papa, look at me. He raised his eyes. They were wet and they were old, and in them she could see the whole architecture of what he hadn't told her. Not just the gambling, not just the debt, but the thing underneath it, the reason someone had been able to use Bruno Valenti as an instrument. The reason he'd had access to Luca's financial records at all. The reason he'd agreed to a game that was never a game. How long? She said. Serena, how long were you working for him? The word working came out wrong. She heard it as she said it, too clean, too professional for what it actually was. What she meant was, how long were you his? And the answer was in her father's face before he spoke it. 3 years, Bruno said, before the debt, before any of it. He came to me after your mother died. He said he'd known her. He said she'd left something unfinished, and he needed someone to help him locate it. He stopped, swallowed. He said if I helped him, he'd make sure you were taken care of. I thought, stop saying you thought. I know. His voice broke on the second word and didn't recover. I know, Serena. I know what I am. Luca had not moved. He was standing 3 feet away and he had not moved, and his face was a surface that told her nothing, except that whatever was happening underneath it was substantial and had not yet found its form. Serena said into the phone, What do you want, Vittorio? The blueprints. All 3 sets. Uncopied. Delivered to an address I'll provide within 4 hours. In exchange, I destroy the documentation on Bruno, and you both walk away from Luca DeSantis' orbit permanently, clean, untouched. And if I say no, then Luca receives documentation that proves his trusted architect's daughter has been working against him since before she arrived, that her father was my instrument for 3 years, that everything, including the contract, was a mechanism to get those blueprints into a location where I could retrieve them. He let this sit. How do you think that conversation ends, Serena? She looked at Luca. Luca looked back at her. His expression was unreadable in the way of something that had been readable a moment ago and had deliberately been made otherwise. She could see the seam of it, the conscious construction of blankness over something that was neither blank nor controlled. He reached out, slowly, and he placed his hand, palm up, on the table between them, waiting. She understood what he was asking, not with words, not with the force that someone in his position could easily have applied. Just a hand on a table, open, patient. Give it to me. Trust the direction this is pointing. Serena looked at the hand. She looked at her father, crumpled against the kitchen counter like a coat that had been hung on the wrong peg for too long. She looked at the blueprints on the table, her mother's careful lines, her mother's hidden language, 5 years in a closet under winter coats, a dead woman's last act of resistance against a man who had never stopped hunting for it. She said into the phone, I'll call you back in 10 minutes. She ended the call. The kitchen was quiet. Say it, she said to Luca. Your father worked for Vittorio. Yes. Before the debt. Before the contract. Yes. Which means everything that brought you here was constructed. His voice was very even. The gambling, the armed men, Bruno's proposal, your 36 hours, all of it. Yes. Including you. He said it without accusation, which was somehow worse than accusation, just a fact being stated and examined, turned over in the light. You could be part of it. I could be, she said. I'm not. But I have no way to prove that to you right now, and you have no particular reason to believe me, and I understand that. She held his gaze. What I can tell you is that my mother spent the last years of her life encoding evidence against the man who is now inside your organization, and that evidence is on this table, and Vittorio Moretti has spent 3 years using my father and 6 weeks using me to find it. You can spend the next 10 minutes deciding whether I'm part of that, or you can spend them deciding what we do next. A long silence. Luca looked at the blueprints, at the decoded account number still visible in her handwriting in the margin of her notebook, at the phone on the counter, at Bruno, who had not moved and was not going to. He looked at Serena. What do we do next? He said. Not a question, a decision being given a direction. She picked up the phone. We give him what he's asking for, she said. Luca's eyes narrowed. The blueprints. A version of the blueprints. She looked at her mother's drawings on the table. I learned to draft from her. I learned her hand, her notation system. I can reproduce these. She let him understand what she was saying. Vittorio Moretti has never seen the originals. He doesn't know what he's looking for beyond the fact that it exists. He'll take what I give him and believe he has it. And the real ones. Stay with you. She paused. Along with every account number I can extract before the 4 hours are up. Something shifted in Luca's face. Not warmth, not yet, possibly not ever. That was not a word she associated with him. But something that was its own form of recognition, the expression of a man who had spent 11 years surrounded by people who moved against him slowly and had just encountered someone moving with him at speed. You have 4 hours, he said. She was already sitting down, already reaching for her pen, already pulling the first blueprint toward her with the focused calm of someone who had found, in the worst morning of her life, the one thing they knew how to do. Her mother's lines under her hands, her mother's language in her eyes. Somewhere outside, Vittorio Moretti was waiting for a phone call and believing, still, that he was the one controlling the shape of this. Bruno sat down heavily in the corner chair. He put his face in his hands. He made no sound. Nobody told him it was going to be fine. Because it wasn't going to be fine. Not for him. Not in any version of the next hours that Serena could currently construct. The thing her father had done, 3 years of it, quiet and sustained, trading pieces of a dead woman's legacy for promises a man like Vittorio would never have intended to keep. That was not a thing that got walked back or papered over. That was a structural failure, the kind that didn't announce itself until the weight came on and then gave way all at once and completely. She knew about structural failures. She'd spent her adult life learning to identify them before they happened. She hadn't seen this one coming. She should have. The signs had been in her father's silences, in the way he'd looked at the floor the night the men with guns had come through his door, in the specific shape of a guilt that she'd mistaken for grief because grief was what she'd expected to find there. She pressed her pen to the paper and began to draw. Outside the window, Florence was going about its morning. The sounds of the city waking, the particular acoustic texture of old streets receiving foot traffic, and the distant negotiation of vehicles through narrow passages. The city that had made her. The city where her mother had bent over a drafting table in lamplight and quietly encoded a truth that had taken 5 years and a criminal conspiracy to finally find its way into the right hands. She drew. She drew with everything she had. Her mother's precision, her own 5 years of trained instinct, the specific muscle memory of a hand that had spent thousands of hours in exactly this motion. And underneath the drawing, in the part of her mind that ran parallel to the work and never fully quieted, she thought about Vittorio Moretti receiving this package in 4 hours and believing he had won. She thought about what he would do next when he believed that. She thought about the window that belief would open, brief, specific, the kind of window that only existed for as long as the deception held. She thought about what needed to happen in that window. She thought about what she was going to have to become to make it happen. The pen moved across the paper, her mother's hand in her hand. The morning light coming through the kitchen window, cold and flat and indifferent, falling across the blueprints of a war that had been waiting 5 years for someone to finally pick up the right weapon and aim it in the right direction. She finished the first forged sheet at the 90-minute mark. It was good. She knew it was good the way she knew when a structural calculation was right, not from pride, but from the specific absence of doubt, the clean feeling of something that held its own weight. Her mother's notation system reproduced with enough accuracy to pass inspection from someone who'd only ever heard it described, with enough deliberate imprecision in the deeper layers to ensure that anyone who tried to use it would find themselves reading a map that led nowhere. The account numbers were real. That was the critical element. She'd kept enough genuine data embedded in the forgery to make it convincing on first examination. What she'd changed, carefully, and in ways that would only reveal themselves under sustained expert analysis, was the routing, the connections between the numbers, the architecture of the thing, which was, after all, what she knew best. Luca watched her work without interrupting. He made calls in the other room, low and rapid, Italian she caught in pieces, movement being arranged, positions being taken up, the machinery of something large and serious being set in motion with the particular unhurried efficiency of a man who had learned that panic was the most expensive operational error. At the 3-hour mark, she set the pen down and rolled the forged blueprints carefully and said, "It's done." He came to the table, looked at the forgery beside the original. She watched his face. "I can't tell the difference," he said. "Vittorio won't either, not today." She capped the pen. "By the time he understands what he has, you'll have moved on the real accounts, frozen them, documented them, passed them to whoever you trust outside this organization." She paused. "Assuming there is someone you trust outside this organization." "There is one person," he said. She nodded. Didn't ask who. That was his to keep. She called Vittorio back, gave him the address he asked for, agreed to his terms in the flat, controlled voice of someone who had decided to comply, which was close enough to the truth to be believable. When she ended the call, Bruno was still in the corner chair. He hadn't moved in 2 hours. He looked like a man who had finished with something, not resolved it, but exhausted it, used up the last of whatever energy shame required, and come out the other side into a gray and structureless place. She stood in front of him. He raised his eyes. "I'm going to finish this," she said. "Not for you. I need you to understand that. Not for you." He nodded. "But I'm not done with you either," she said. "When this is over, we're going to talk. All of it. You don't get to keep any of it." He said, "I know." She picked up the forged blueprints and walked to where Luca was standing, and together they walked out of her father's apartment into the pale Florence morning, and the city received them the way it received everything, without judgment, without ceremony, with the ancient and absolute indifference of a place that had seen worse and would see worse again. The trap was set. The clock was running. The address Vittorio gave them was a palazzo in Venice. Of course it was Venice. Serena thought this in the car on the way to the airport, looking at the address on her phone with the specific dark humor of someone who had stopped being surprised by the theatrical instincts of dangerous men. Venice, the city that was already sinking, already half consumed by the thing it was built on, already beautiful in the specific way of things that were dying slowly and knew it. Of course, a man like Vittorio Moretti would choose Venice for the end of something. The flight was 40 minutes. Luca spent it on the phone and then not on the phone, sitting beside her with the stillness of a man conserving something. She watched the clouds below them and thought about load-bearing walls. "How many families are attending tonight?" she asked. He looked at her. "How did you know about the families?" "You said the palazzo. The Grimaldi Palazzo has been used for interfamily gatherings for 40 years. It was in a case study I read in university. The architecture, not the criminology." She paused. "Vittorio chose a night when every major family in Italy would be in the same building." "Yes." "He's going to present the accounts. Show them I exposed their finances to a third party. Frame me as the leak." She turned to look at him. "He doesn't need to kill me tonight. He just needs to make every person in that room want to." Luca's jaw tightened. "Yes." "So the forgery alone isn't enough. Even if he can't use the blueprints, the accusation stands." "The accusation stands unless I discredit it publicly. Tonight, in that room." He looked out the window. Which means I need to walk in there with something that makes every family in that building understand that Vittorio has been stealing from all of them. Serena reached into the bag at her feet and pulled out a folded set of papers. The real decoded account notations. The numbers her mother had hidden, the routing structures, the names of institutions. She'd made 2 copies in the Florence apartment before they left. She held the papers out to him. He took them without a word. There's enough there to show movement from 7 different family accounts into structures Vittorio controls, she said. I cross-referenced the account numbers with the dates on my mother's annotations. She was documenting transactions in real time. She watched him do it. For how long? At least 2 years before she died. Serena said this steadily. She'd had 3 hours with the information, and she'd made her peace with the shape of it, or as much peace as was available. She knew exactly what she was looking at, and she knew exactly how dangerous it was to be seen knowing it. So she hid it in the only place she was certain no one would think to look. Her daughter's inheritance. Her daughter's inheritance. She looked at her hands. She trusted me to find it eventually. She just didn't know it would take this long. The plane began its descent. They landed at Marco Polo and took boats. Not the tourist route, but the service channels, narrower and darker. The city arriving around them in pieces rather than all at once. The light was going. Venice in the early evening had a specific quality of illumination, golden and slightly wrong, like light that had passed through too much water to remember where it started. Serena had been here twice before, both times for architectural tours, both times in the blue and ordinary light of midday. It looked different at dusk with 4 armed men in the boat beside her. The plan was simple. Simple plans were the only kind that worked, Luca had said, not philosophically but practically. The way a man said things he'd learned from specific failures. Serena would enter with Luca as planned. Vittorio expected her to deliver the blueprints, expected her to be controlled and cornered, expected the evening to proceed on the schedule he'd designed. She would play that. She would play it through the first hour, long enough for Luca's men to position themselves, long enough for the financial documentation to be distributed to each family's representative by runners who were already in the city. At 9 o'clock, Luca would stand up in that room and end Vittorio Moretti's 11-year performance. What happened after that was, as Luca had said with the bleak precision she'd come to recognize as his version of honesty, uncertain. How uncertain? She'd asked. Sufficiently, he'd said. She'd taken that as the answer it was, and stopped asking. The Grimaldi Palazzo rose from the canal like something that had decided centuries ago to be permanent, and had succeeded through sheer conviction. Stone and water and light and the particular grandeur of a building that had absorbed enough history to stop being impressed by it. Boats were arriving from multiple directions, figures in formal clothing moving through the entrance in 1s and 2s, the surface of the evening smooth and correct and revealing nothing. Serena was wearing a dress Julia had produced from somewhere, dark, structured, the kind of garment that suggested authority without announcing it. She walked beside Luca through the entrance and felt the specific quality of a room's attention shift when he entered it. Not dramatic, not performative, just the quiet acknowledgement of a large space that a significant variable had arrived. She kept her face arranged and her breathing even and looked at the room the way she looked at buildings, for structure, for load-bearing elements, for the places where the weight was and where it wasn't. Vittorio Moretti was across the room. She found him without trying, the way you found a sound that had been bothering you once you finally identified what it was. He was 60, perhaps 62, silver-haired, and well-constructed in the way of men who had spent their lives performing respectability. He was talking to 2 men she didn't recognize, a glass in his hand, and he looked exactly like what he wanted to look like, a trusted advisor at ease among colleagues. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Something moved in his face. Not surprise. He'd expected her, had positioned this entire evening around her arrival. But something else, a flicker of assessment, a rapid recalculation that crossed his features so quickly she would have missed it if she hadn't been specifically watching for the seam between what he showed and what he was doing underneath. He smiled, raised his glass slightly, a greeting between people with an understanding. She smiled back. It was the hardest thing she'd done all day. The first hour was architecture of a different kind. The structure of pretense, the load-bearing walls of performance, everyone in the room maintaining the surface while the thing underneath it built pressure. Serena moved through conversations she wasn't following, answered questions about herself in the vague terms of a woman who'd been introduced as a colleague of DeSantis without further specification, ate food she didn't taste from plates she barely looked at. Luca moved separately. She could track him by the subtle gravitational effect he had on the room. The way conversations near him gained a certain quality of care, the way men who were themselves powerful allowed a specific additional margin when he was adjacent. She watched this and thought about what it meant to have built that kind of gravity and then to have it quietly undermined for 11 years by someone standing directly beside you. At 8:20, Marco Riva appeared. She hadn't expected him. She stood very still when she saw him across the room, her glass halfway to her mouth, and ran the calculation in 3 seconds. Marco, who had warned her off in the outbuilding. Marco, who Luca had said was spoken to. Marco, who was here tonight in a room he had every reason to be in as a senior member of Luca's organization, and who was standing 12 feet from Vittorio Moretti with the specific body language of two people who had agreed in advance not to acknowledge each other. She set her glass down and moved toward Luca. She reached him at the edge of a conversation he was extracting himself from and put her hand on his arm and said quietly, close enough that only he would hear, "Marco is here. He's with Vittorio." She felt the muscles under her hand go still. "Where?" he said, the same volume. 11 o'clock, near the east window. She didn't look. They're not speaking, but they arrived within 2 minutes of each other, and they've maintained the same distance since. A pause of 3 seconds. "All right." "Marco knows your operation. He knows your men. If Vittorio is using him, he can tell Vittorio which of my people in this room to neutralize first." Luca's voice was very low and completely level. "Yes, I understand. How many of your men can you still trust in this room?" 4, possibly 3. "Against what Vittorio has?" "I don't know yet." She looked at him directly. Up close, in the candlelight of the palazzo, she could see what the controlled surface cost him. The specific tension around his eyes, the jaw held at a fraction too much pressure. He was running everything simultaneously, and the seams were beginning to show, just barely, in the way that structures showed stress before they failed. A hairline, nothing visible to the casual eye, everything to someone who knew what to look at. "Stick to 9 o'clock, she said. "If Marco has compromised my men, stick to 9 o'clock. You walk to the center of this room and you stand up and you say what you have to say and you let the documentation do the work. Vittorio's power in this room depends on these families believing he's their ally. The second they see the account evidence, that's gone." She held his eyes. "You don't need your men to win this. You need 30 seconds and a room full of people who just found out they've been robbed." He looked at her for a long moment. "You should have been doing something other than architecture," he said. "I am doing architecture," she said. "I'm just doing it with people." At 8:50, Vittorio found her. He materialized from the crowd with the smooth, unhurried movement of a man who controlled the timing of everything, and he was beside her before she'd registered his approach, which she suspected was deliberate. A small demonstration of capability, a reminder of who had designed this evening. "You brought the documents," he said. Not a question. "They're secure," she said, as agreed. "And Luca," he glanced across the room, "he believes you're here under duress. He believes what he needs to believe." Vittorio looked at her with an expression that was almost warm, the specific warmth of a man who respected competence and was allowing himself to show it. "Your mother was remarkable," he said. "She saw everything and said nothing, for years. I always wondered if she passed that quality to you." Serena's chest tightened. She kept her face still. "She passed me her drafting hand. And her discretion, apparently." He turned his glass in his fingers. "I want you to know that what happened to her had nothing to do with me. She died of natural causes. I want that to be clear between us." "I believe you," she said, which was true. Her mother had died of a heart attack at 53. Fast, clean, nothing to investigate. She believed that Vittorio hadn't arranged it. She also believed that her mother had known she was running out of time, that the encoding of the blueprints had been completed in the last year of her life with the specific urgency of someone who understood the window was closing. After tonight, Vittorio said, this is finished. The accounts are restructured, the documentation disappears, and you and your father resume your lives without complication. That's what I promised Bruno, and it holds. Understood, she said. He nodded and moved away through the crowd, and she watched him go and thought about her mother bent over a drafting table in lamplight, encoding a dead man's confession into the margins of a building that would never be built, trusting the math and the language and the daughter who hadn't yet learned to read it, trusting that eventually the structure would bear the weight it was designed to bear. 8:58. She found Luca's eyes across the room. He was already moving to the center. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet in sections, the way sound died in a large space when something changed the acoustic. One conversation stopping, and then the next, until the silence had propagated across the entire room and everyone was looking at the man standing in its center. Luca DeSantis didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. I have something to show you, he said. All of you. Men appeared at the edges of the room. Not as men, neutral men, the runners Serena had coordinated, moving through the crowd, distributing envelopes. She watched the envelopes open, watched faces change as eyes moved across printed account numbers and names and transaction histories that covered 11 years of patient theft from every organization represented in this building. The silence transformed. It became a different kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too large for sound to contain. Vittorio Moretti stood 12 feet from her and did not move. He was watching the room with the expression of a man watching a structure he'd built very carefully and very slowly begin to come apart at a speed he hadn't calculated. Then Marco Riva moved. He came from the left, fast and direct, not toward Luca, but toward Serena, and she had approximately 1 second to understand what was happening before his hand closed on her arm and something cold and hard pressed against her side, and he said against her ear, "Don't." She didn't. The room had seen it. The reconfiguration was immediate. Luca turning, his men moving, Vittorio's people moving, the careful social architecture of the evening dissolving into the raw geometry of threat and position. Someone overturned a table. Glass broke. A woman near the door made a sound and then stopped making it. This doesn't change the documents, Luca said. Still that voice. Level. Almost quiet. He was looking at Marco and the gun against Serena's ribs, and his expression was a controlled surface over something that she could see now very clearly was not controlled at all. Every person in this room has already read them. The documents are forged, Vittorio said from across the room. His voice had changed. The warmth gone, the smooth cultural construction stripped away, something underneath it that was older and harder and had been running the whole show from the beginning. She produced them. The architect's daughter, the woman Luca brought into his house, into his confidence. Everything she touched is compromised. The accounts are real, Luca said. Verify them. We'll verify nothing on her word. Then verify them on mine. A beat. Your word, said one of the men near the window. Older, gray-suited, the representative of a Palermo family whose name Serena didn't know, has been vouched for by Vittorio Moretti for 11 years. The room absorbed this. Serena felt the weight of it. The thing Vittorio had understood from the beginning, the specific vulnerability he'd spent 11 years constructing. That Luca's credibility in this room ran through Vittorio. That every relationship Luca had maintained with every family present had been brokered and managed and filtered through the man who was now standing across the room claiming the evidence was fake. The gun against her ribs was very cold and very steady. Marco's breathing was controlled, trained breathing, the kind that meant he'd done this before and wasn't afraid of where it ended. Serena thought, load-bearing wall. She said clearly into the room, "The annotations on the original blueprints are in my mother's handwriting. Every person here can have a handwriting analyst verify them against any document Anna Ferraro signed in her professional career. There are hundreds." She paused. "My mother worked for Vittorio Moretti's predecessor at Rossetti Developments from 1997 to 2001. She watched him build the account structure from the ground up. She documented it in the only language she trusted, her own. Silence. "Rossetti," said the gray-suited man from Palermo. Quietly, like a word he'd buried a long time ago. "Rossetti," Serena said, "ask Vittorio how he survived the Rossetti collapse when everyone else went to prison, or worse. Ask him what he gave the prosecutors. Ask him whose names he handed over and whose he kept." She felt Marco's grip tighten on her arm. She kept her voice even. "Then look at the accounts again and ask yourself whether the money he kept for himself is more or less than what your family has lost in unexplained shortfalls over the past decade." The gray-suited man looked at Vittorio. Vittorio looked at Serena with an expression that was past strategy now, past the performance of respectability, past all of it, just the face of a man looking at the specific thing that was ending him, with the particular quality of attention you gave to something you hadn't seen coming and couldn't stop. "Enough," he said, and nodded at Marco. Marco's arm came up, and Bruno Valenti came through the side door with a gun he didn't know how to hold properly, and 23 years of bad decisions, and one moment of something that wasn't redemption exactly, but was the closest available approximation, and he said in a voice that cracked on every syllable, "Let go of my daughter." Marco turned. Luca moved. The room erupted. The next 40 seconds were noise and movement and the specific chaos of a space where everyone had been waiting for permission to stop pretending and had received it simultaneously. Serena drove her elbow into Marco's diaphragm, not skillfully, not cleanly, but with everything she had, and felt him fold and use the half-second it bought her to move away from him toward the nearest wall, putting stone at her back, getting clear of the center. She saw Luca cross the room in 6 steps and take Marco down with an efficiency that had no wasted motion, no drama, just the application of trained force to a specific problem. She saw Vittorio's men moving and Luca's men meeting them. She saw the gray-suited man from Palermo standing completely still in the middle of everything, reading the envelope in his hands with the focused attention of someone who had decided that the violence around him was secondary to the numbers in front of him. She saw her father. Bruno was against the wall near the side door, the gun hanging from his hand now, his face the color of old concrete. He'd been hit. She saw it as she crossed toward him, a cut above his eye, blood running into his brow, his breathing the wrong rhythm. She reached him and put her hands on his face, and he looked at her with the eyes of a man who had done one right thing and was surprised to find it hadn't killed him. "You came," she said. "I followed the boat," he said. "I've been following you since Florence." He swallowed. "I couldn't let you—" He stopped. "I couldn't let you be the one who had to end it. I'm not the one ending it." "No." He looked across the room. "He is." She looked. Luca had Vittorio against the wall near the tall windows overlooking the canal, one hand at his collar, and he was saying something she couldn't hear over the noise of the room. Vittorio's face had gone from fury to calculation to something that looked, for the first time all evening, like genuine fear. The specific fear of a man who had spent 11 years believing he understood the person in front of him and was discovering in the worst possible moment that he had not. Whatever Luca said, he said it once. Vittorio closed his eyes. The fighting in the room was resolving. Not cleanly, not without cost, but resolving. The geometry of the evening shifting toward a new configuration as Vittorio's men found themselves outnumbered not by Luca's people, but by the representatives of 6 families who had just finished reading the account documentation and had arrived, independently and nearly simultaneously, at the same conclusion. Outside on the canal, Serena could hear the boats, not their boats, other boats, the sound of motors and the specific acoustic of megaphones over water, the Italian of law enforcement at volume, the kind of organized arrival that didn't happen by coincidence. She looked at Luca across the room. He looked back at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled surface, not the processing quality, not the thing she'd spent weeks learning to read. Something underneath all of that, something that had been there the whole time and had been very carefully not shown, and was showing now in this specific moment because the room was in chaos, and he was looking at her across it with the specific expression of a man who had just stopped performing for the first time in longer than she could calculate. She held his gaze across the burning room and understood something she hadn't let herself understand before. That the contract had never been the whole of what was between them, that trust built under pressure was still trust, that whatever this year had been meant to be, it had become something else entirely in the space between a poisoned wine glass and a forged blueprint and a man who had stood in a doorway and looked at her bruises like they were personal. The boats were louder now, lights through the canal-facing windows, blue and white, moving fast. Luca released Vittorio, stepped back, looked at the man who had sat beside him for 11 years with the expression of someone closing a door that had been open too long. "It's done," he said. Not to the room. To himself, she thought, maybe to her. Vittorio straightened his jacket with the automatic gesture of a man whose self-presentation had become involuntary. He looked at Serena with something she didn't expect. Not hatred, not calculation. Something closer to recognition. "Your mother would have won eventually," he said. "She was always going to win." "She did win," Serena said. "It just took longer than she planned." The side doors came open. Law enforcement filled the room with the organized noise of an operation that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Timed, Serena understood, against the financial documentation that had already been transmitted to investigators outside Italy before the evening began. One of the people Luca trusted outside his organization, apparently, wore a badge. Marco Riva was on the floor. Vittorio Moretti held out his hands for the cuffs with the resigned dignity of a man who had always known, at some level, that the structure he'd built was temporary and had built it anyway. Bruno slid down the wall onto the floor, not unconscious, just finished, emptied of everything he'd been carrying for 3 years, sitting on the marble floor of a Venetian palazzo with blood on his face and both hands open in his lap. Serena crouched beside him, put her hand over his. He turned his palm and held on. "I'm sorry," he said. For the 1,000th time in 5 years, except this time, it covered things she hadn't known about until today, and it landed differently. Heavier and more specific, and somehow, because of that, more honest than the version she'd been receiving since her mother died. "I know," she said. That was all. Luca reached them. He looked down at Bruno, then at Serena. He offered his hand. She took it and stood. Outside on the canal, Venice was receiving all of this the way it received everything, with the absolute indifference of a city that had seen empires dissolve into its water and had continued quietly to sink at its own pace regardless. The trap had closed. The accounts were frozen. The documentation was in the hands of people who would use it. It was over, except that Luca was still holding her hand, and neither of them had moved to change that, and the room around them was full of noise and consequence, and the particular aftermath of a night that had dismantled several things that would not be rebuilt. And in the middle of all of it, that specific fact held its own quiet weight, like a load-bearing wall neither of them had known was there until everything else came down around it. The aftermath of violence had a specific texture that nobody warned you about. It wasn't the noise. The noise stopped eventually. It wasn't even the physical residue. The overturned furniture and broken glass and the smell of something burnt that lingered in the palazzo's old air long after the source of it had been removed. It was the particular quality of silence that followed, the silence of a space that had contained something enormous and was now holding its shape around the absence of it, the way a room held the shape of furniture after the furniture was gone. Serena sat on the steps of the palazzo at 11:40 at night with her shoes off and her feet on the cold stone and her father's head on her shoulder, and watched the last of the law enforcement boats move away down the canal. Bruno was conscious and had been assessed by a medic and had a bandage above his left eye that made him look simultaneously more fragile and more present than she'd seen him look in years. Like the bleeding had drained something that had been building pressure for a long time and left him smaller but more accurately himself. He hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. She hadn't asked him to. The water was very still. Venice at midnight had a quality she hadn't experienced on either of her previous visits. The tourist surface completely gone. The city reduced to what it actually was under all the performance of itself. Stone and water and age, and the specific melancholy of a place that had survived everything by the simple method of refusing to be anything other than what it was. Luca came out through the main door at 11:53 and sat on the step above them without asking whether it was all right. He had a cut on his forearm that someone had dressed badly, the bandage already coming loose at one edge, and his jacket was gone and his shirt was open at the collar, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a person rather than a structure. He said nothing for a while. None of them did. Eventually, Bruno said, to no one specifically, "Is it finished?" "Vittorio is in custody," Luca said. "Marco, 4 others. The financial documentation has been received by investigators in 3 countries." He paused. "It's finished." Bruno exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carried weight. Months of it, years of it, the accumulated mass of a secret held too long in a body not built for that kind of load. "And me," he said. "You came to Venice without being asked," Luca said, "with a gun you don't know how to use, to help your daughter. That doesn't undo what I did." "No," Luca said, "it doesn't." The honesty of it landed without cruelty. Serena felt her father absorb it, felt the slight change in the weight of his head on her shoulder, the acceptance of a man receiving something true and deciding not to argue with it. "What happens to me?" Bruno said. "That depends on choices you make in the next few weeks," Luca said. "The investigators will want your account of Vittorio's recruitment methods. Your cooperation has value. How much value depends on how complete your account is." A pause. "I'd recommend complete." Bruno closed his eyes. "Yes," he said. "All right." They sat in the silence after that for another few minutes, the 3 of them on the cold stone steps above the dark canal, and the city held itself around them, and the water did what water did, which was move and reflect and reveal nothing. The formal investigation took 4 months. Serena knew this in the retrospective way she came to know the whole of the aftermath, not as a single continuous experience, but as a series of specific moments separated by stretches of ordinary time that felt slightly unreal, the way ordinary time always felt slightly unreal after something had rearranged the fundamental architecture of your life. She went back to Florence. She went back to her apartment, her cat, her drafting table. She took on 2 new clients and completed the outbuilding assessment she'd started for Luca's estate, completed it remotely, sending annotated plans and structural recommendations by email in the professional language of an architect doing contracted work, which is what it was, and also something else, a thread of continued contact that neither of them named or discussed. She visited her father twice a week. He was cooperating with investigators, as Luca had suggested, with a thoroughness that she suspected was his own version of paying a debt, not to Luca, not to the legal process, but to whatever remained of his relationship with his daughter, the only currency he had left that was worth anything. He'd stopped drinking. She didn't comment on this. She brought food and sat across from him at the same kitchen table where everything had broken open, and they talked about ordinary things, carefully, the way you talked around a structural repair that was ongoing, not pretending the damage hadn't happened, just working around it while the materials cured. He told her once that he'd gone to one of Vittorio's recruiters originally because he'd been afraid after her mother died that he wouldn't be able to take care of Serena financially, that the debt had felt like failure, and the offer had felt like a solution, and he'd understood within 6 months that he'd made a catastrophic exchange, and by then the exit wasn't visible anymore. She listened. She didn't forgive him in the moment. Forgiveness, she'd decided, was another kind of structure, and you couldn't rush the curing time without compromising the integrity. But she stayed at the table. She thought that counted for something. The blueprints were submitted to investigators in January, all 3 sets, originals and the forgery both. The forgery itself serving as evidence of the lengths to which Vittorio had gone to retrieve what her mother had hidden. The handwriting analyst confirmed Anna Ferraro's authorship within 2 weeks. The account structures her mother had documented proved more comprehensive than even Luca had anticipated. 23 years of transaction records, names, institutions, amounts, a dead woman's meticulous accounting of a theft she'd witnessed and encoded and trusted to time, and her daughter's eventually sufficient attention. The case against Vittorio Moretti was, the investigators told the press in the careful language of people who didn't want to overstate things, substantial. Serena read this in her apartment on a Tuesday morning with her cat on the drafting table ignoring her and her coffee going cold, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief. Something that occupied the space between them, the specific emotional register of a thing being completed that should never have needed to be completed at all. She thought about her mother. She did this often now. Not the grief of the years immediately after the death, the raw, close-quarters grief that took up residence in your chest and stayed, but something longer and slower, something that had more information in it now and was therefore more complicated and somehow, paradoxically, more bearable. Her mother had been a woman doing her work and watching something wrong and deciding to do something about it in the only way available to her, which was quietly and in the margins and in a language only one other person in the world could eventually read. She had trusted Serena with the only thing she had. She had been right to. Serena picked up her pen and went back to work. Luca came to Florence in March. He called the day before. Not a message, an actual call, which she'd come to understand as his distinction between things that mattered and things that didn't. He said he'd be in the city on Thursday and asked if she had time. She said yes. He arrived at her studio at 2 in the afternoon, alone, without the armored cars and the rotating men that she'd understood as the permanent grammar of his movement. He looked different in Florence, in her space, not smaller exactly, but more specific, less institutional, more like a person who had a particular history and carried it in a particular body. She made coffee. He looked at the drawings on her table with the focused interest of someone who is genuinely looking rather than performing the act of looking, which she'd learned to distinguish. The outbuilding renovation, he said. I submitted the final plans last week. She set the coffee beside him. Your site manager has everything. I know. He said they were exceptional. They're thorough, she said. Exceptional is his word. Something moved in his expression. That thing she'd stopped trying to name and had started simply registering a frequency that had been present since the beginning and had been allowed gradually to be less concealed. I came to tell you something, he said. She leaned against the table and waited. Vittorio's prosecution is going to take another year at minimum, possibly 2. Several of the families who are in that room in Venice are going to spend that time managing their own exposure, their own compliance, their own relationships with investigators. He looked at his coffee. My organization is going to look different in 2 years than it does today. Significantly different, deliberately so. I know, she said. I've read what's been reported. What's been reported is incomplete. He said this without complaint, just as fact. What I'm doing is more complete than the reports. The trafficking operations that were running under Vittorio's financial management, those are gone. The accounts that were funding them are frozen or converted. The people who were dependent on those operations for income are being transitioned. He stopped. It's not clean. I want to be clear about that. Some of what I've done over the years is not addressable by transition. Some of it stays on the record regardless of what I do now. I know that too, she said. I'm telling you because you should have accurate information. She looked at him. Why does it matter what information I have? He looked back at her. He had the stillness she'd spent months learning to read, and in it now she could see what she'd been seeing for a while and had been careful not to state, because stating things made them structural and structure bore weight, and she'd been waiting, without entirely knowing she was waiting, to feel confident the foundation was adequate. Because you matter to me, he said, and I don't say things I don't mean. The studio was very quiet. Outside, Florence was conducting its afternoon. The sounds of the street below, pigeons on the windowsill, the distant negotiation of a delivery truck through a narrow passage. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a life that had been going on the whole time through everything. The contract is finished, she said. Yes. The year ended 6 weeks ago. Yes. So this isn't... She stopped, started again. You're not here because of an obligation. No. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the first time she'd seen him, across a study above Lake Como, a fire burning in a room that wasn't cold, a man who'd been painted as a monster and had turned out to be considerably more complicated than that designation allowed. She thought about a poisoned wine glass, and a scored elevator cable, and a kitchen table in Florence, and a room full of burning marble corridors, and her father sliding down a wall with blood on his face and a gun hanging from his hand. She thought about a hand, palm up, on a table. An open question without pressure. The specific patience of someone who had learned, possibly the hard way, possibly from watching what impatience cost, to wait for the answer that was actually being given rather than the one that was convenient. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him. Between them, the coffee, the drawings, the ordinary objects of her working day. No contract, no obligation, no emergency requiring immediate resolution. "Tell me what you're actually building," she said. "Not the reported version, the real one." He looked at her. Something in his face opened, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that things opened when the person doing the opening had spent a long time being careful and was making a considered decision to be less so. And he told her. So, Bruno Valenti died on a Saturday in late April. Not violently, not from anything connected to the events of the previous year. His heart, which had been carrying more than hearts were designed to carry for longer than was sustainable, gave out while he was making breakfast in his kitchen. The coffee was still in the pot when the neighbor found him. The doctors said it was fast. Serena sat in the hospital corridor for 2 hours after they told her, not because there was anything to do there, but because she needed a place that was neither the apartment nor anywhere else she recognized. A neutral space where she could be with the information before she had to carry it back into her life. Luca came. He arrived at the corridor 40 minutes after she called him. She hadn't planned to call him, had called him before she'd decided to, which she thought later was its own kind of answer to questions she hadn't explicitly asked herself. He sat beside her without touching her and without speaking and without performing the specific repertoire of comfort that people deployed in hospitals, which she'd always found unbearable. Though we'll get through this and he's at peace now, and the reaching for hands that hadn't asked to be reached for. He just sat there, present and quiet and not requiring anything from her. After a while she said, "He came to Venice." "He did." "He couldn't have known it would work. He just came anyway." "Yes." She looked at the corridor floor, white tile, the particular institutional white of surfaces designed to show what landed on them. "I wasn't finished being angry at him," she said. "I know. I had more to say." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that the worst part? That you don't get to finish?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave to things that deserved it. "I think the worst part is different for everyone, Sad," he said. "For me, it was that I didn't say what needed saying while there was time. That I assumed time." She looked at him. He was looking at the floor, and she could see in his profile the specific weight of something personal in what he'd just said. Not performed, not offered for her comfort, just true. A man with his own history of things left incomplete. "Who?" she said quietly. "My father," he said. "We had arguments that never resolved. He died with them still open." A pause. "I spent years being angry at him, and then I spent years being angry at myself for the years I wasted being angry at him. Eventually you put it down, not because it's resolved, because you can't carry it and move at the same time." She sat with this, tried it against the weight in her chest. It didn't make the weight lighter, but it made it more accurately shaped, defined rather than formless, which was its own kind of help. She reached out and put her hand over his on the seat between them. He turned his hand and held on. The same way Bruno had held on in Venice, she thought. And the thought didn't break her, it just moved through her and left a mark, the specific mark of something that connected things across distance and time and the particular devastation of imperfect love. They sat there for a while. The corridor did what hospital corridors did, which was continue, indifferent and necessary, around them. The estate above Lake Como had 3 buildings when she finally walked them in person. Not from photographs, not from partial plans, but physically. Her boots on the ground, her hand on the stone. It was May. The lake was green and silver, and the hills above it were doing something complicated with light that she'd have needed a better vocabulary than she had to describe. She walked the outbuilding first, the one whose photograph she'd spent weeks with, saw immediately 3 things her plans had gotten exactly right and 1 thing she wanted to revise. The relationship between the east window and the internal staircase. A question of light she couldn't have assessed from images. She made notes. She photographed. She stood in the center of the main room of the outbuilding and looked up at the ceiling and felt the quality of the space, the way it held air, the way sound moved in it, the specific personality of a room that had been many things over several centuries and had kept traces of all of them. She could work with this. She could build something here that was honest about what the structure had been and clear about what it was becoming. Luca found her in the second building at mid-afternoon. He'd been in meetings all morning, the legitimate business operations that were absorbing more of his time now, the transition from one kind of empire to another that was slow and complicated and not reported accurately, and that he discussed with her in the way he discussed things that mattered, which was directly and with the specific vocabulary of someone who wasn't interested in making it sound better than it was. He stood in the doorway of the second building and looked at her crouched over her notebook in the dusty light and said nothing for a moment. "The east window in the outbuilding needs to move 18 inches north," she said without looking up. "All right." "It changes the staircase relationship. The plans will need revision." "All right." She looked up. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed in the afternoon light behind him, and he was looking at her with that expression, the one she'd stopped trying to name and had started simply accepting as a feature of the landscape, something present and real and requiring no further analysis. "You're staying," he said. Not a question, but not an assumption either. It had room in it for her answer. She stood up, dusted her hands on her trousers, looked around the building, its stone walls, its complicated ceiling, its windows that needed rethinking, its bones that were good, and its surface that needed everything. "I'm staying," she said, "but I want an office, a real one, not a room with a desk, proper drafting space with north light." "There's a room on the third floor." "I know which room, the one with the 3 windows. I've been thinking about it since October." She tucked her notebook under her arm. "I also want a formal contract, work contract, separate from everything else. Written terms, scope of work, payment structure." Something moved in his expression. "Everything documented." "Everything documented," she said. "I'm an architect. I don't build things without plans." He looked at her for a moment. Then he did the thing she'd seen exactly twice before. The thing that had been a smile once and still retained enough of the structure to be recognizable as its descendant. "I'll have it drawn up," he said. She crossed the room toward him. He held the door. She walked through it into the May afternoon, the lake below the walls doing its complicated thing with light, the hills above doing theirs. Behind her she heard him follow. His footsteps on the old stone were even and unhurried, the specific rhythm of a man who had stopped performing the management of time and had started simply moving through it. They walked back across the grounds toward the main house. They didn't hold hands. That was for corridors and hospital seats, for moments that needed anchoring. This was different. This was just 2 people walking across a hillside above a lake in May, one of them with a notebook full of structural revisions, and one of them with his hands in his pockets, both of them moving in the same direction at the same pace without having discussed it. Inside the main house, in the fireplace of the study where they'd first sat across from each other 8 months ago, a different lifetime, a different version of both of them. A piece of paper was burning. She didn't know exactly when Luca had put it there. She found out later it had been March, the day he came to Florence and sat across from her at the drafting table and told her the real version of what he was building. He'd come back from that trip and gone to the study and fed the contract into the fire, without ceremony, without witness, without telling her. The original, notarized, signed in duplicate contract that had traded 1 year of her life for her father's debt. No signatures remained, no obligations. The paper became ash, and the ash went up the flue, and the lake outside the window received the March air without comment. She found out about it in May, from Julia, who had seen him do it and mentioned it the way Julia mentioned things, briefly, plainly, without interpretation, leaving the interpretation to whoever needed to do it. Serena stood in the doorway of the study when Julia told her and looked at the fireplace, cold now, May being too warm for fires, and thought about what it meant to destroy a document that had already been superseded by circumstances, to make a gesture that no one was watching, and that changed nothing legally, and that was therefore entirely about something other than legal reality. She thought about what her mother had encoded into margins of drawings that no one was supposed to read. She thought about what her father had done in a Venetian palazzo with a gun he didn't know how to hold. She thought about the specific grammar of people expressing things they didn't have direct language for, and how that grammar, once you learned to read it, was everywhere. She went to find Luca. He was in the office, always working. That hadn't changed. He looked up when she came in. She stood in the middle of the room, the same place she'd stood 8 months ago when she'd refused to sit and he'd registered it as a data point. "The contract," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes." "March." "Yes." She looked at him. Outside, the lake was doing what it always did, holding its light and its depth and its indifference, beautiful and ancient, and entirely unconcerned with the small human negotiations being conducted above its shoreline. "You could have told me," she said. "I know." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing words the way he always chose them, carefully, with the specific attention of someone who understood that words were structural elements and bore weight. "Because I wanted it to be about the fire," he said. "Not about what you did with knowing it." She stood with that, turned it over. Let it settle into the accurate shape of what it was. A man who had spent his entire adult life surrounded by transactions and leverage and the weaponization of information, making a deliberate choice to give something without building a return into it. Just burning a piece of paper in private because it was the right thing to do and not telling anyone. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of his desk and picked up his coffee cup and drank from it, which was not something she'd done before, which was a small thing and also not a small thing. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside, the lake held its light. The hills held their green. The old stone of the estate held everything it had always held, centuries of it, layer on layer, the accumulated weight of all the things that had happened here and been survived and transformed into the specific density of a place that had decided to endure. The greatest debt, she thought, had never been the money. It had been the fear that had kept her father making small, terrible choices for 3 years, the fear that had kept her mother encoding her truth into margins instead of speaking it, the fear that had kept Luca behind a controlled surface for so long that the surface had begun to be mistaken for the person. She had been afraid too. She'd arrived in this house afraid, and she'd stayed afraid for weeks. The productive fear of someone who understood their situation clearly and responded to it with their eyes open rather than closed. There was no shame in that. Fear was information. The question was always what you did with it. What she'd done with it was work. Draw. Think in structures. Read the load-bearing elements of a situation and calculate what they could hold. What she'd built, without a plan, without intending it, in the margins of everything else, was this. She set his coffee cup down. She looked at the lake through the window. "I want to redesign the main terrace," she said. "The drainage is wrong, and it's been wrong for decades. You can see the water damage on the north-facing stone." "I've been meaning to have it addressed," he said. "I'll do it." She picked up her notebook. "It'll take most of the summer." "All right," he said. She stood up, moved toward the door, stopped. "Luca." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "For the fire." He held her gaze for one long moment. Then he looked back at his work. Not dismissively. Not with the controlled withdrawal she'd once read as indifference. Just a man returning to what he was doing, in a house that was being rebuilt around him, on a hillside above a lake that had held its ground through everything and intended to continue. She walked out into the corridor and down the stairs and out onto the grounds, her notebook under her arm and the May light coming down clean and specific across the stone terrace she was already redesigning in her head, fixing the drainage, addressing the decades of avoidable damage, getting the water to go where it was supposed to go instead of where it shouldn't. It was good work. It was real work, the kind that left something standing when you were done. She put her pen to the paper and began.